Programming Windows with Dave Plummer.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves customers building mission-critical software systems. Quick announcement before we get into it. We're in the second year of my software architect forums, and we've added on the software leadership forums for managers and executives. And if you lead a software team, either the lead engineer or the technical architect, or if you oversee a custom software team, then these forums are for you. Peer groups, and we sharpen each other. I facilitate the forums, but they are just robust conversations of peers. And the architect forum is more on the technical side, and the software leadership forum is more on the managerial and executive side. So you can find it at clearmeasure.com/forums, and we'd love to see you. We do them once a month, and I'll also include a link in the show notes. And for those looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories, and you'll be able to find those videos. My guest today on the show is Dave Plummer. Dave was a developer or development manager on each of the major operating systems from MS-DOS 6.2 through Server 2003 while at Microsoft from 1993 to 2003. He's worked on the MS-DOS product, Ole objects, Windows 95, Windows NT, and the NT Pinball game. He also wrote and helped design the initial prototype of Windows Media Center. And Dave also added product activation to the Windows platform, including various anti-tampering mechanisms to prevent illegal copying of the product. And he's also worked on Task Manager, zip folders, calculator, as he focused on the Windows shell. And he currently runs a very popular online show called Dave's Garage on YouTube, where he demystifies various software engineering topics. Well, Dave, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I think probably a good number of our listeners also enjoy your Dave's Garage show on YouTube. And certainly amongst my peers, we all kind of tuned in for your excellent deep dive on the CrowdStrike outage and kind of what all the nuts and bolts of how that came to be. So it's a very useful show. And if the listeners have not seen your YouTube channel, we'll include a link in the show notes and encourage everyone to go see you on there. So
I appreciate that.
I want to kind of back up and ask you about current things. But first, going backwards, you were at Microsoft for about a decade. What was it? Starting in the early 90s?
93.
Yeah. Can you tell us about what it was like back then? Because I think a lot of the programmers who are listening to the show today were not in the industry when you were at Microsoft. Can you give us some context of what it was like then?
Yeah, I actually wound up there because I read a book called Hard Drive on Microsoft and Bill Gates and what they were doing and the software and MS-DOS and their whole system of how they got things done, and they seemed pretty hardcore. And I wound up getting an internship there. And when I got there, I'm fresh out of college, or I'm still in college as for the initial internship. And the people I'm working with there are some of the smartest and best developers in the world. Because Microsoft was incredibly selective, especially in the very early days when there were very few people. Now there were like 10,000 by the time I got there. But a lot of these guys had been there much longer. And so it was kind of like walking around amongst giants, and you were scared to say anything for fear of sounding stupid. And of course, there's always a certain amount of imposter syndrome when you get thrown into an environment like that. And it was an incredible environment in which to grow and learn, because everybody was so incredibly smart and knew what it was they were doing to such a deep level. Or if not everybody, there were certainly the vast majority of people were in that class. So great place to work, and a great place to imprint on people earlier in your career, I think.
Yeah, I bet. I didn't have my first programming job until 1997. And of course, then I'm just kind of learning, like, how do I get code to talk to a database? I mean, just the basics. And you're working on the shell of, one of the most popular operating systems, or probably the most popular operating system so you were there from 93 to 2003?
Right.
Okay. So what were the big things that led you to working on a particular part of Windows? I think it's such a big product. You can do so many different things. How did
Right.
you get into a certain group, or what were the forces at play?
I think I was always fascinated with UI. I worked on the Amiga for a long time, and I eventually loved the toolboxes for building UI, laying out dialogues and drop downs, and building a user interface that you could interact with, handling the state and code. I tinkered around with, I think it was Borland Turbo C, and they had their T window classes, and you could build UIs through that. And it's just something I love to do. So when I got into Microsoft, it wasn't something I sought out initially, but I was working on the Ole Com team, and I saw a preview of the Windows 95 shell. And I was kind of blown away, but I think everybody was to a certain extent when they
Yeah.
finally saw Windows 95 in contrast to Win3.1. So my first experience was, holy cow, how do I get to be a part of that? And in our group, there was a guy named Bob Day, and he was experimenting with trying to take the code from Windows 95 and getting it to run on NT. And I think a fellow named John Vert, who worked on the kernel team, had already got it to work or compile to a certain extent in ANSI and so forth. But then we took all of their code, and I got the opportunity to join the team and had to interview all over again. So you don't just bounce around inside Microsoft. When you change teams, you go through another 5-hour interview loop. So, but I got on the team and spent the next several years porting all of this code from Windows 95 to Windows NT, and then rewriting sections that had to be operating system dependent or to fill gaps in functionality that, NT has file compression, encryption, and things that Windows didn't have. So you've got to add UI, and the format dialog was one of those things as well, because I don't think the shell handled formatting in Windows 95. I don't even know how to format a disk in Windows 95 now that I think of it. Probably properties off the A drive or something, but I've never done it, I guess. And so I was always fascinated by the UI side of things. And then that would lead to, an in-depth investigation of, well, when I need to do this, how does this work? And then I would follow kind of that as a trail. But the great thing about porting code is you see so much of it. And even if it's not the best code, most of it's professionally written, and it's already debugged to a certain extent by the time I got it, because they were close to shipping Windows 95. And you learn a ton by going through hundreds of thousands of lines of other people's code, especially debugging it and doing it in a debugger. You get to know a piece of code pretty intimately when you've single stepped it and looked at the call stack enough times that you're kind of at home with it.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you got something working in ANSI, just for the developers. You're talking about ANSI C, right?
No, actually, it's ANSI text. So it's 8 bits, 1 byte per character in Windows 95, ASCII or ANSI, whereas Windows NT is all Unicode, where it's 16 bits. So every assumption about the size of a character is suddenly wrong when you try to compile it for Windows NT. So anytime a programmer in the original code assumed that, well, if I allocate 12 characters, that's 12 bytes, that assumption is incorrect. Even if you use Sterling on it, it's still incorrect, because now it's multiplied by the number of bytes per character. And so most of the code has to be gone through almost line by line to look for exceptions, and spend a lot of time doing that.
Right. I think on one of your shows, you talked about the Windows NT start menu and the graphic on the side of it, and working on getting that text. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and actually, I've followed up on that video, because it turns out that the code that I'm describing in the video was written, and I talked to the dev lead since after publishing the episode to say, well, am I insane? Did I write this code? And he's like, yeah, you wrote it. And so I never worried about it again. And I said, well, what happened? Why is it actually a bitmap? It's actually a static bitmap still in the shipping product. And it turns out that, I guess, when the setup team gets to build at the last minute, they decided it was easier to take these 16 or however many bitmaps they had that they'd already created and stick them in, because the code just had to be if-deffed out, and it went back to bitmaps. And so that's how it shipped. So I wrote the code to paint the sideways stuff on the start menu, and checked it in for the NT builds. But at some point it got taken back out, and I wasn't aware of that. So
Gotcha. But there's so much code that goes in those massive products. I mean, that's a lot there. Now, you've had just a number of years have passed. 21 and counting since then. What, in your mind, what has been the biggest changes in just being a software engineer since then? And what are the things where it's the same?
Well, in terms of things that are the same, I think because I do a lot of embedded programming, it's not that different than coding in the 90s on a PC. And your debugging experience is very similar. Half of it's printf debugging, and I don't have source level debugging on the ESP32 working. So it's very similar to really olden days programming. But even when you're working on a modern thing, the ability to single step through code and keep mental track of what's going on and be able to at advanced levels spot synchronization errors between threads and all that, that's all going to stay the same, even with AI. Doesn't matter how much code AI writes for you, at some point it's going to have a deadlock between threads and somebody's
Mm-hmm.
going to have to figure it out. And that skill set is still going to be valuable. The things that have changed the most, I mean, when I came out of Windows, I had never coded graphics beyond, the Commodore 64 games and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
I spent the year or so going through my Foley and Van Damme book and writing 3D stuff from scratch and then learning DirectX because I was retired at this point and kind of needed something to do. And then I realized what a huge landscape that is. Like you look at Unreal Engine and it's hard to comprehend everything that's going on in there. And I certainly don't myself. But it makes me aware of how little I know when it comes to that kind of topic. So some new areas like graphics and now AI have exploded where you can spend a lifetime now trying to gain expertise in areas that really didn't exist when I was in my career.
Well, that's interesting. The high level and the user interface technologies, they seem to come out at a quick clip, but they seem to come and go as well. Is that, in your estimation, are there any UI technologies that you think have staying power that 20 years from now we'll look and say, oh yeah, that was such a fundamental idea, we're still going to be doing that 20 years from now, versus, oh no, that was how we used to do it?
I think the start menu itself, although maybe not in its current form, is a classic concept that's still useful. And that's why if you install any Linux distro, it's still got a start menu on it pretty
Mm-hmm.
much because there's not a better idea out there, I think, at this point. The problem, of course, is the start menu is not quite as pure as it used to be, and it's not as easy to find and launch and as, say, Windows XP as a contrast.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there are priorities that drive that. It's not my decision. And if it were up to me, it would just be a really straightforward menu that launched the most common things you wanted to launch without advertising and weather and all that other stuff. But
Yeah.
they've got to monetize it somehow. So,
Right.
but I think that whole concept is pretty fundamental. I think Task Manager itself, it's ubiquitous. You can go to Unix and run HTOP or top, or you can go to the Mac and run Activity Monitor. And there's always going to be one on the system, I think, for that kind of idea. And as they evolve, they get more similar than they were different, I think. So bigger things like that, I think, are kind of ubiquitous. I don't know if that answers your question.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Well, there's so many, I guess the average age of programmers is kind of going down average. There's so many more young professionals getting into computer programming. Out of all the languages they could choose, C++, Java, C#, Python, just everything out there, how would you advise a young programmer in how to think about which language to dive into and invest in learning?
I guess it depends on what your ultimate goal is and where you want to spend your time. If you want to do systems or embedded code or device code, any of that kind of thing, then you should probably just learn C++ and be done with it. And then learn C# and JavaScript and whatever else comes after that for you. But if you are more interested in application or back-end programming, then I would probably go towards C# if it were up to me, or Java. But I prefer C# over Java, I guess, probably for loyalty and just familiarity reasons. But I think it's pretty elegant what they've done with it. So, but I think everybody should know Python either way.
Okay.
It's almost like a second lingua franca. What's the word?
Lingua franca?
Yes, thank you. Common language amongst developers almost that it. And if you're reasonably competent with Python, you can be assisted by ChatGPT so much now at this point that you at least have to understand the code that's coming out of ChatGPT. So I think it's handy for that reason alone.
Okay. So you mentioned C++ for systems or embedded programming. Is that side of the market still increasing, or because it's so much of the motivation is I need to be in a good labor market. I need to have enough jobs available. And, depending on where you are, you might think, oh, I can only work in, a handful of companies if I only do C++ versus I could work in every business under the sun that needs a database system. So you were in that world. I've actually never been in the embedded world. How is that market? Does it continue to expand?
Because I'm retired, I don't really know what the market demand is for various languages at this point. I'm just thinking in terms if I had to make myself marketable without doing the research in advance, what I would suggest. And, I could be somewhat dated and maybe Rust is so important now that you should learn Rust, but it seems like you should probably learn C++ first and then learn Rust. And
yeah.
You can argue too that you would make bad habits in C++. So it's important to learn good C++ and not 1996 C++.
Right. I learned a little bit of what mistakes could happen with just reading about all the Windows XP Service Pack 2 work to go and fix a whole bunch of things.
I forget. Was it a Service Pack 2 or 3? I forget. Whichever one was the big security push. It was quite a wide push, and it was up to that point. It's not that nobody cared about security, but everybody thought of security more in the aspect of protection between the user and the system space, and that was almost inviolable, or it was trying to be.
Yeah.
But the idea of having malicious code attack your machine over the internet, of course, was a fairly new concept, and the code reflected that it hadn't been a big priority, but suddenly, because of the way the internet had evolved, it became one in a big hurry. So
yeah. So it seems like the 10 years that you were at Microsoft kind of shaped a lot of things that you do, and you're still, even on your Dave's Garage channel, you talk a lot about Windows tech and still working in that. Where have your interests gone over the last 20 years in the tech space?
I took a foray into graphics, as I mentioned, mostly for my own self-education. And then I did some web-based stuff to try to get my skills up and learn asynchronous client-server model across the browser, things like that. And then I've spent the last 5 years or so working mostly other on the channel and writing on embedded software for the ESP32 and to a certain extent the Raspberry Pi. So,
okay. Can you tell us what the ESP32 is? I think a lot of listeners just aren't familiar with that.
Sure. It is a very tiny little processor that costs about $2, and it has 520K of RAM. It can have up to 8 megabytes of additional RAM beyond that you can have on the chip. And then it's got a bunch of flash ROM up to 8 meg as well. So it's a good size. It's not something you would load Linux onto, although I think that has been done. It'd be painful. But it's powerful enough that it has free RTOS on it, which is a real-time operating system that does threading and everything else. And the C support is really good, so you can write very modern applications for it. And so I'm using it for LED control to draw matrices and control LED installations over Wi-Fi because it has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built into the chip. So it's great for communications as well. So it's a fun chip to tinker with.
It's a system on a chip. Roughly how big is it?
I think they're under 6 by 6 millimeters if you get the bare one. The module is more like a square centimeter, but the actual chip, if you were to build your own module, would be about the size of a pencil eraser.
Okay. It's obviously very small. What's the options to hook it up to I/O?
Well, let's see if I can hold this up here. So this is an ESP32 on a little PCB that I made that plugs into a matrix, a 64 by 32 matrix that draws stock ticker, weather, basic little infotainment center. And this is the ESP32 module right there. And now it's going to focus. So I have to be careful with the big silver box.
A little over half of a Raspberry Pi as I'm looking at it. As far as
and this is not a very dense board. You could make this board 1/3 the size, but it's a board I designed and I'm not that clever. So.
Right. Okay. So the system on a chip is really meant for somebody to design their own printed circuit board and connect some IO modules and then send it off to get printed and come back.
Yeah, you can buy them already in modules that have the USB-C adapter and pinout, to get the GPIOs and so on. And so you can run them as a little module. You wouldn't mass produce something that way, but for experimentation and prototyping, for about $5 to $10, you can get them in a module with the breadboard pins on them and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's been a push with .NET along the years for the .NET micro framework, and then of course with Linux and whatnot, so that C# can run on systems on a chip. What is your thinking architecturally about using a flavor of C# and the layers that go into that versus just using C++ straight away?
It really depends on what you're doing, and it depends how much overhead there is from the if it's mono or the .NET runtime on the chip. Because as I said, you only have 520K to work with,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know how much mono or .NET takes from that pool and leaves you with. I have no idea. It could be 20K, it could be 300K, and I really don't know the answer to that because I've never done it. But if you can work in C# on the embedded chip, and it's an environment that suits your needs, I think it would be a great way to go.
I think that's an open question, given the last 14 years. So many schools, not just university computer science programs, but so many coding schools have popped up to prepare young programmers with the knowledge of some language, and so many of them are just they get taught JavaScript, and then they're a web developer, and then they learn, okay, now I can talk to databases, and now I can talk to queues, and now I can talk to backend stuff. And so the career started with a very high level language, and of course C# and ASP.NET, those are very high level. So I think there's a lot of people in the industry that start with that, and then if they're going to go towards embedded, have to make some sort of transition. Versus when I started my career in the late 90s, it was the internet was this weird thing that people were getting into, and then the rush to the internet. It was the other direction. It was the web technologies were the second and third and fourth technologies learned, whereas now we're in an era where the web technologies are the first technologies learned.
Yeah, and I was especially fortunate because the time when I first got into it, you were looking at a machine like the TRS-80 or the PET with 4K and a 6502 and an IO chip.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could understand all of that. And then as the systems got more complicated, it's kind of like Paul Bunyan lifting the bull every day. It's as the systems got more complicated, I would learn as I went. And all I had to do was keep up with technology.
Yeah.
But if you're born, 20 years or 30 years later, and you just kind of pop into the market right now, it must be an incredibly intimidating experience to try to understand everything that's going on because it would seem impossible.
Right.
I've tried to keep up to date on everything that I can. And even now I have, cursory knowledge of many areas. So
yeah,
it would be quite a shock, I think, to come into it cold.
Absolutely. I know very little C++. I mean, just enough to be dangerous, but I've never really gone deep into it. Even since '97, it jumped straight into the next level that ran on top of C++. So even to go there, in the time we have left, I'd love to kind of get your experience extrapolated, some of the things you're thinking about on into the future. You mentioned AI and how AI is going to write bugs and a person is going to have to figure it out.
Right.
What are you paying attention to with current technology and technology trends? AI being one that's getting a lot of press, a lot of people talking about it. But what are the ones that you're looking at where you think, wow, this is really interesting?
Certainly, the new coding model, the O1 model from ChatGPT, seems really good at coding. I actually asked it to write top for Unix because I have a 211 BSD running on my PDP-11, but there's no top command. And so I gave it the source code to PS, and I said, take this and make it into top. And it got very close. It got 2/3 of the screen full, and then it crashed when it hit some limit on its number of processes that it could hold. But I was impressed in that it basically was able to produce what is an albeit simple application, but almost an entire application. But I think we're a ways away from that yet, where I can type in my product spec and have ChatGPT crank out the code base for it. But I think we're going to get there eventually.
Mm.
And so that's going to split development into. No, I don't like the term prompt engineer because you could say that somebody writing a specification doesn't serve any purpose. Well, of course they do. They're doing the thought and the definition and everything else. So there's a lot of value in the program manager side too, which is essentially what you might get a lot of, and then people that are debugging and assembling and working components out and working on the AI side of things. So there may be less, raw Python programmers in the middle than there are today, I think.
What do you think of the whole workflow of asking a large language model to generate some code, but then that code seemingly is checked into Git? Not the original prompt that was successful, but the actual code is checked into Git. And then we have to ask, okay, who maintains this code that was generated?
Yeah, I guess it's whoever checked it in takes responsibility for it to a certain extent, but there's no warranty of maintenance on any code that gets checked in. I think people should certainly, when they use ChatGPT to either create code out of whole cloth or even the major segments, they should probably disclose in their comments that, hey, ChatGPT wrote this, but there's no requirement that people do. But I think it would be nice.
Yeah, because people leave the company and then there's this whole swath of code. It's like, okay, now somebody's got to maintain it. I almost think of the spectrum on which you could have a code base where it's really fast to generate code and they have a whole bunch of code, versus you have an application that does the same thing because you found all of the available libraries that you could use and you do accomplish the same thing, but the number of lines of code is really small because you made more use of libraries. And I'm just wondering how that'll play out over the long run.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it doesn't eventually come down to you basically defining the interface contracts for components, and then ChatGPT can produce and worry about all the code for the component as long as it meets the interface definition. And at that point, you don't care how many lines of code it is, to a certain extent, obviously within reason, as long as it performs well and fulfills the contract. So it can be a black box that you don't debug. We're not there yet because it's not that robust at developing that code, but it'll get there soon enough.
Yeah, at some point. Awesome. Well, you have so much content on your YouTube channel. Are there some topics where it just really spurred your imagination more than others that we should highlight and point the listeners to?
Let's see. There was an episode I did a long time ago called The Sexadecimal Mystery, which is why the HAL computer from 2001 probably was run in sexadecimal rather than hexadecimal, what the difference is, why that originated. And at the end of the episode, I give you my best guess as to the reasons why, but I still to this day don't know why sexadecimal uses the numeric KSN JFL that they use instead of A, B, C, D, E, F. And it'll make more sense if you see the episode.
Sure.
And it's got a cool edit of 2001 that I like. So watch it for that part.
Space Odyssey 2001?
Yeah.
Nice. Well, before the show, I was mentioning that I and a lot of my coworkers got a lot of benefit from your commentary on the CrowdStrike outage and exactly, what part of Windows boot was affected and how that could even be possible and all that. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes for the listeners as well. But do you ever run out of ideas for the channel, or do you have a queue a mile long?
Both. So I've got a little to-do list. I think I just looked 113 things that I could do episodes on. But it has to be at any moment. It's got to rise to the level of, I really want to work on that. So I've got a lot of ideas that are good enough to do an episode if I were doing this for a living and had to crank one out every 5 days or whatever. But sometimes it is challenging to think of an idea that I'm really passionate about. But I usually seem to have one or two irons in the fire. And as long as I've got that going on, I'm set.
Yeah. Nice. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show. This is fascinating to speak with you and kind of look back on your time at Microsoft and the time that's expired since. Before we sign off, is there anything else that we should point the listeners to?
No, I think if you check the channel homepage for Dave's Garage, you'll find me and you'll find the content. So
perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. It's definitely my pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.